Welcome now to segment 5 of lecture 4. We continue with the focus on the interpersonal grammar, the interpersonal clause grammar. So we're located within the interpersonal metafunction at clause rank. We've dealt with the major system, the dominant system of the clause as a move, the system of dialogue, if you will, the system of mood. But we now introduced a related aligned system supporting mood in different ways and dependent on mood, the system of modality. Let me do a bit of a recap before we continue. So we've seen that modality is in fact a cline between the categorically positive and the categorically negative. So if you have a proposition or proposal, it may be categorically positive proposition, it is, or categorically negative proposition, it isn't, or a categorically positive proposal, do, and a categorically negative proposal, don't. But in between, you have a scale, a cline of continuum, a space that's constructed by the system of modality, giving language users, speakers and their addressees more space to negotiate between positive and negative. So we've looked at this, the modality of propositions, modalization, and the modality of proposals, modulation. So in the modality of propositions, modulation, you have this intermediate space, the continuum between it is and it isn't. And there are 3 degrees of value: high, medium and low. So if we start and we use the probability type of modalization as an illustration, if we start with it is, then high degree of probability is it must be, median is it should be, and low it may be, and then categorically negative it isn't. Similarly with proposals, we have these 3 degrees, these 3 values, high, median, low. So again, if we start with categorically positive, do, then high obligation would be you must do, median obligation you should do, and low obligation you may do, which is what we know as permission. And you may do then shades into categorically negative, don't. Let me take an example from a piece of dramatic dialogue from the film Candlelight in Algeria from 1944. There's a proposition here, being sorry or not being sorry for past action. So the categorically positive from the speaker's point of view is I'm sorry, and the categorically negative is I'm not sorry. There would be 3 degrees of modality in between. I must be sorry, I should be sorry, I may be sorry. And what the person here says, I should be sorry. That's, in other words, obligation to be sorry, median. And the addressee says, you needn't be sorry, meaning you're not under obligation to be sorry. So you're not sorry, close to you're not sorry. That's the space between categorically positive and negative that is negotiated in this little exchange from Candlelight in Algeria. So we jump in medias res, in the middle of things, in the middle of action. The 2 interactors are Alan Thurston and Susan Foster. And they, in Algeria, trying to escape a situation. Alan Thurston says, tired? Susan Foster, a little. Rest a little. Susan, I'm sorry I behaved too badly this morning. Alan, you behaved wonderfully. I'm the one who should be sorry for letting you in for all this. Susan, you needn't be. I said I should be, but I'm not. Susan, neither am I. So we see that Alan and Susan both have a good sense of the categorically. I am sorry, I'm not sorry, and the intermediate degrees. And in particular, this is brought out when he says, Alan, I said, I should be sorry, but I'm not. So he's reporting on what he said before, and then he's contrasting that with what he actually feels. I'm not. So let me just illustrate this from a passage from the film from 1944 with Candlelight in Algeria.
Tired?
A little.
Rest a bit.
I'm sorry I behaved so badly this morning.
You behaved wonderfully. I'm the one who should be sorry for letting you in for all this.
You needn't be.
I said I should be, but I'm not.
Neither am I.
So, as the passage illustrates, modality is part of the negotiation of the calibration of the relationship between interactants. And I cut off here. You could imagine different follow-ups from this as James Mason leans in on the leading woman. So that's a bit of a recap. And the point then is that the system of modality has evolved as a region between the categorically positive and negative. So in a sense, open up a space between these two outer poles of polarity. Of course, it can be combined with both positive and negative polarity. I said, I should be, you needn't be, positive and negative polarity. But the interpretation then of the system of modality is as part of the resources that the interpersonal systems of semantics and lexigram provide us with for negotiation. Negotiation then involves calibrating, renegotiating the relationship among interactants, as illustrated very briefly here. Let's now take a step back and look systematically at the system of modality. More specifically, modality type. So as we've already seen, there are different ways of moving from categorically positive to categorically negative. And that's the system of modality type. So that applies to a clause whose diacticity is modal rather than temporal. And the basic choice in modality type is modalization. So the modality of propositions, if you will, of statements and questions, where what is assessed is the validity of the information being negotiated, versus modulation, the modality of proposals, where what is assessed is not information, but rather the act of exchanging goods and services. So attaching a degree from high to low on the exchange itself. Modalization, the assessment of information, has two subtypes, probability and usuality, and we met them already. Modulation also has two subtypes, obligation and readiness, and within readiness, the most frequent type, or the dominant type, is inclination or willingness, but it also includes ability, or more generally, potentiality. But let me now illustrate these. We'll start with examples of modulation and then turn to modalization. So modality modulation. And just by way of a reminder, let me quote again the way that we characterize it in IFG4. In a proposal, the meaning of the positive and negative poles in prescribing is prescribing and proscribing. Positive, do it; negative, don't do it. Here are also the two kinds of intermediate possibility, in this case depending on the speech function, whether command or offer. 1. In a command, the intermediate points represent degrees of obligation, allowed to, supposed to, required to. So low, median, high. In an offer, they represent degrees of inclination. Willing to, anxious to, determined to. So again, low, median, high. We shall refer to these scales of obligation and inclination as modulation, in order to distinguish them from modality in the other sense, that which we're calling modalization. So modulation is a modality of proposals, modulation that of propositions. Let's start with obligation. So modulation has two subtypes, obligation and readiness. And I said within readiness, the dominant category is inclination or willingness. But let's look at obligation first. Here's an example of a text from a register where obligation dominates. It's highly favored. And these texts tend to be ones of enabling some kind of activity, typically regulating the activity. And we find this in legal text, in the laws, or the regulations of an association, agreements like tenancy agreements and so on. This little text is an extract from a school association involving parents and members of the school. And I'll pick up here, section 3, school staff. The association shall not exercise any authority of the teaching staff or any matter relating to the control or management of school. School staff may become members of the association. The principal of the school or the principal's nominee shall be member ex officio of the association and its members and its committees. Membership will be open to all parents, blah blah. The association shall maintain a register of members, blah blah. Annual subscription shall be a member of the association, etc. The register shall. Okay, so you see quickly here that the most common finite is shall. And that's an expression realization of obligation. What degree of obligation? Well, high obligation. So in general, as I mentioned before, in present modern English, shall would seem to be on its way out. It's certainly fairly marginal in the system of modals. It's not very frequent. It's lost all contact with what used to be its past equivalent, should. So there is no temporal relationship between shall and should. And the range of uses are very different between shall and should. But shall does occur in certain registers, as I said, and this is one of them. And if we read the text from beginning to end, the excerpt, you see that you look at obligation, that's chosen again and again. So it's reinforcing the sense, clause by clause, that this text is about obligation. And if you look at the modality value or the degree of obligation, you see it's varied, but most of them are high with shall. One is low, permission, may, and a couple median with should. So one could actually study this as the text unfolds, looking at the successive selections in the system of modality. So when we analyze these clauses, as I said before, we see that interpersonally speaking, the operator that serves at finite is precisely the modal operator shall. Here with the passive shall be composed of. And I took this example from the basic law that guides Hong Kong, general principles. The Hong Kong Special Minister Region shall safeguard the rights and freedoms, etc., right? Shall again. And it applies, of course, the obligation rests with the subject, but when the clause is passive, that may be somewhat diffuse. But this is certainly a typical example of modality modal obligation in a text from a register where this is quite central. And in general, of course, we do associate obligation, choices and obligation, with authority. And here's a little example from a few years ago during the campaign for the election or selection of the next chief executive officer of Hong Kong. And you remember a retired judge was in the running. He's one of the candidates, Kuo King. And in a interview, he was quoted as saying, right, Hong Kong is free to discuss independence. So what is free to discuss? Well, it's something we'll come back to. It's not a modal operator, right? In terms of the finite, it's temporal, but free to discuss. That actually means permission is allowed to discuss. So meaning low obligation permission. So he's saying in Hong Kong people are allowed to discuss, but, and then he goes on to say, but we can't go beyond that. And what does can't mean? Now we have a modal auxiliary as fused with a negative, is not allowed to do, or is required not to do. So two different angles of getting in. So can't go beyond that. That's high obligation. And you can see then how this relates to, I mean, the discourse itself here is, the text itself is a reporting one, but it relates to authority and the assessment by authorities of degrees of obligation from high to low to permission. Let me give you one more example. The use of the modality of obligation goes with commands and offers, as we've seen. Okay. And low obligation, that may be an offer to do something. And that's illustrated from this passage from the film Five Fingers. Five Fingers. And here the actress to the right is Danielle Dallier. She plays a countess who's lost all her property, but she's still a countess. And here she gives permission to one of the servants. So it's just a little example. You may retire. So in terms of obligation, it's not you're obliged to retire, it's not you expected to retire, but you're allowed to retire. But then comes a straight command, notice, and that's categorically positive. Just turn out the lights. And he says, thank you, madam.
You may retire. Just turn out the lights.
Thank you, madame.
Incidentally, this film, Five Fingers, is a great entertainment from the early 50s. And the actress was a fantastic French actress, active for decades in France, contributing to the French culture of the cinema and so on, here in an English-speaking part. And she passed away just a year or two ago at the age of 100. And she actually was active into her 90s in film. Let's now look at another type of modulation. So we looked at examples of obligation. Now the other type is readiness. So readiness includes both inclination or willingness and ability, or more generally, potentiality. So let me give you an example here of potentiality or ability. And it's from an Oscar ceremony from 1970, and a little exchange between two Hollywood legends, Bob Hope and Fred Astaire. Now, Fred Astaire was, of course, known as a supreme dancer, also singer, supreme dancer of musicals from the classic Hollywood period, beginning in the 1930s up through the 50s, and even with one or two in the 1960s. This is 1970. He was born in 1899, so he's 70 or 71 here. And Bob Hope was not much younger. He was born in 1904. So Bob Hope says to Fred Astaire, let me ask you, you don't dance anymore, do you? And Fred says, no, Bob, I gave it up last year. Bob, why? Oh, some things just don't go on forever. For instance, I used to be able to, and then he demonstrates a few steps. I can't do that anymore. Bob, I know, neither can I. That's a shame. So listen to this exchange and look at what Fred Astaire does when he says, I used to be able to. Now, used to be able to, of course, an interesting combination. The actual modality of ability, potentiality, comes in the predicator, one of these periphrastic expressions of modality. We'll come back to that more systematically. Used to means essentially habit in the past.
Thank you, Bob.
Let me ask you, you don't dance anymore, do you?
No, Bob, I gave it up last year.
Why?
Oh, some things just don't go on forever. For instance, I used to be able to, I can't do that anymore.
I know, neither can I. That's a shame.
That's a shame, isn't it? Yes. Now we can stop at this point, but let me use what follows here as an interlude to give you a little bit of time to relax, a few minutes, not to have to listen to me. Again, the contrast this interlude illustrates is I can't do that anymore. So that's, in effect, Fred Astaire stating something about his readiness, his ability, negative, I can't do. And you can contrast that with the unspoken reality. So the contrast this statement about negative ability with the unspoken reality. And that's what I'll give you a few minutes of.
When you hear music, doesn't the beat do something to you?
Nothing.
Well, don't you miss dancing?
Oh, sure, Bob. I sit in my rocking chair and cry all day long.
Only all day. I only give it about 20 minutes, Fred.
I see.
But you've never danced in the Academy show, huh?
No, I haven't. No.
And you're not going to tonight?
No, I'm not.
That's what you think. Yeah. Elmer, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Bob, for the best achievement.
All right. So this is a nice illustration of the importance of not enacting oneself as not having ability. I can't do that anymore. Now, this is, of course, a joke. But remember that he was a legend of musical, seen as possibly the greatest dancer of the Hollywood musicals, sometimes together with another one. And the two of them actually performed about 5 years later together in an Academy special called That's Entertainment. But I'll leave that for later. Now, so you see, don't ever say I can't do that. To me, it goes with I'm confused. I'm confused sounds positive, and grammatically it's positive, but negative, lexically it's negative. So don't say I can't do that or I'm confused. Don't deny yourselves ability. Right. Let's now go on to the other major type of modality. So we've looked at modality of the proposal kind, obligation, readiness, and we now look at the other kind, modalization, which, as you remember, is modality of propositions, of the assessment of the validity of propositions. A bit of a recap here from IFG. So in a proposition, the meaning of the positive and negative pole is asserting and denying. Positive, it is so. Negative, it isn't so. There are two kinds of intermediate possibilities. One, degrees of probability. Possibly, probably, certainly. So again, that's low, medium, high. And degrees of usuality. Sometimes, usually, always. So again, low, medium, high. The former, that is probability, is equivalent to either yes or no. That is maybe yes, maybe no, with the different degrees of likelihood attached. The latter are equivalent to both yes and no. That is sometimes yes, sometimes no, with different degrees of offenness attached. It is these scales of probability and usuality to which the term modality strictly belongs. We should refer to these to keep them distinct as modalization. So while obligation is often used in philosophically, logically influenced account of modality as deontic modality, modalization of the type probability, again, when influenced by the philosophical tradition, as epistemic modality. But these accounts tend to miss out. They tend not to take account of usuality, for example. In any case, these are then degrees between categorically it is so and categorically it is not so for negotiating the validity of a proposition. And to illustrate this, let me turn back to Pinter's birthday party. So here's a little sequence between Meg and Petey. You remember Meg and Petey are a married couple in their 60s running a boarding house somewhere on the south coast of England. And they're talking about their lodger, Stanley. And Meg starts with temporal. Is Stanley up yet? Petey, I don't know. Is he? I don't know. I haven't seen him down yet. Well, then he can't be up. Haven't you seen him down? I've only just come in. He must still be asleep. He must be still asleep. So you see, it's both temporal and modal. Is up. Is he? Haven't seen. Haven't seen. Have you seen? I've only just. And then it's modal. Can't. Must. And both these are assessments of information. In fact, both mean high probability. Positive, he must be asleep, he can't be up yet. Okay. And then we have, interestingly, these additions, I don't know, I don't know. And of course, I don't know means I don't know if Stanley is up. So we will come back to these, I don't know, in the negotiation of the validity of propositions. So again, if we focus on modals as finite, right, you have must here, and we can gloss that as I know, I'm sure he's still asleep. He must still be asleep. So that might suggest inference leading to I know, I'm sure. So it's using a modal auxiliary is one of those that's used with high degree. must, shall, ought to. So the example could have been he ought to still be asleep. Okay. So modal operators as finites, and the whole we can now he must still be asleep. We can supplement it with the high one with median. He will still be asleep. He may still be asleep. And these come in between. He's still asleep and he isn't still asleep. So modal auxiliaries as finite. Now you can compare this with expressions of the I know kind. So I'll introduce it now and then we come back to it and treat it in some more detail. So here, I must still be asleep, you can gloss as I know he's still asleep, or I'm sure he's still asleep. And in fact, that's an alternative way of doing it. Or he will still be asleep, I think he's still asleep, or he may still be asleep, I guess he's still asleep. So these are different expressions, constructions, not involving a modal auxiliary, but what looks like a mental clause with the subject, sensor, speaker, I, in present tense, and with the verb of sensing, more specifically cognition, know, think, guess, imagine, suppose, reckon, and so on. And these are in fact, as we shall see later, ways of making the assessment embodied in modality explicit as subjectively my view. This is my view. So he must still be asleep. Implicitly, I think he's still asleep, but I know he's still asleep, then I'm making it explicit that it's my opinion. We'll come back to that. So we have then this scale between positive, he is still asleep, and negative, he isn't still asleep. And then the modals, just as with obligation, introduce these three values, high, medium, low. He must still be asleep, he will still be asleep, and he may still be asleep. So that's the scale, degree of probability in this case. Now to give you a sense of how this works in the context of the dramatization of birthday party, let me play you a little extract from one of the versions that we've looked at before. So this is now with Joan Plowright as Meg, and initiating this exchange in the ongoing dialogue between her and Petey.
Is Stanley up yet?
I don't know. Is he?
I don't know. I haven't seen him down yet.
Well, then he can't be up.
Haven't you seen him down?
I've only just come in.
He must be still asleep.
So you see how much work is involved in this little exchange. Of course, in the assessment of validity, bringing in evidence you have seen or not seen, and so on. That's important. But also, if we were interested in the tenor of the relationship between the two, this is one of innumerable exchanges they must have had over the decades, if we assume that they married as young people, knowing that they're now in their 60s. Again, this seems like very ordinary English, close to what we casual conversation, but it's printer's genius, among other things, to infuse drama, even the drama of menace, not in this case, but in other cases, in what seems to be very much like ordinary casual conversation. Now, of course, modalization and modulation may combine, so they may work together in any passage of text. And let me give you one example of this, how the two work together. So this is from an episode of the long-running, highly celebrated comedy series Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, a kind of taking the mickey out of British politics and the civil service. And here you have two civil servants. Sir Humphrey is the one who's part of every episode and one of the main characters, discussing, I think, how you avoid getting ministers to initiate some kind of activity. So in an imagined dialogue with whoever the responsible minister is, stage one is, if you're a civil servant, you say, nothing is going to happen, purely temporal. Stage two, something may be going to happen, but we should do nothing about it. Stage three, maybe we should do something about it, but there is nothing we can do. And then stage four, maybe there's something we could have done, but it's too late now. So in blue, you have the modalizations, may, maybe, maybe. In red, the obligations, should, and then in orange, the readiness. So I thank Wangbo for this example. I don't know what the Chinese glossary says, but as I said, it's from the long-running series, Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister. Have a listen.
Stage one, we say nothing is going to happen.
Stage two, we say something may be going to happen, but we should do nothing about it.
In stage three, we say that maybe we should do something about it, but there's nothing we can do.
Stage four, we say maybe there was something we could have done, but it's too late now.
Okay, this may actually be useful to you in your working lives. So end of this segment. And next, we will continue with modality for a while. We'll also sort of broaden out other kinds of assessment, and we will look at realization of modality beyond the finite element. We've already seen hints of this, like be able to, for example, and I know, or I don't know, but we will begin to explore this more systematically in the next segment.